Hello everyone, welcome to a new tutorial. My name is Hadil and this video is going to be about loading text files into processing. So as you can see here, I prepared what we're going to use. So we're going to use a bunch of lyrics from different artists, and I already saved all of these files or all of these text files into my data folder. So I have the song lyrics in each of these files, and I created an array over here that is commented out right now for all of these text files. Generally, the idea is to visualize the text into different shapes. So we're going to create something resembling flowers based on the characters or the lines, because loading a text file into processing is going to use the load string method, and that will create an array of strings that we can use. So I'm going to use that to grab each line and then making a flower or something resembling a flower from each of those lines based on the number of characters. So we'll do something that we already did before in terms of having points around a circle. I think we've done that several times, or I've shown it several times in either my Skillshare course or one of the tutorials here, probably. I can't really keep count, but I know that I've mentioned it before. So we're going to use that, and we're going to use curve vertices as well. And I like reusing some of the things that I've used before just to show you that simply because I've used it before doesn't mean that's the only way to use it. Generally talking, I like to combine some of the old things that I've learned before with any new techniques that I've learned and create something new. So kind of like my constrained noise, I do know how to create noise and I know how to create a grid, and I thought, why not just constrain each agent into its own cell? And that's how that came about. So it's just a bunch of ideas that are already there combining into a new project. So this is basically the same thing. I'm just importing text files, and we're going to use that to play with the values of each character to create, like I said, something resembling a flower. So let's start by creating the object, and I'll create a new file, and I'm going to call it flower. And that will be, of course, a class, because we're going to create everything we need in here, and then we're going to call it in the main tab. So if you've seen any of my other tutorials relating to points around a circle, whether it's on Instagram or YouTube, then you'll know that the first thing that we'll need is the number of points on that circle. And I'll call that length for length, and it'll be an integer. And then I will also need the string because I'll use it for something else later on. So I'll pass in the string from the lines that we're going to load from one of these text files. So I have 3 text files over here that I put inside of an array, but we're only going to do this example for one of the files for now. And then later I'll show you how I'm going to just flip through all of these just to see the different examples or how the different lyrics actually change the look. I'll also need positions. I'll put it inside of a p vector just because I don't want to have 2 float arrays. So I'll just combine it inside of a p vector that I'm going to call position. And this is the trick for the flower. So I'm going to create an array of floats that I'm going to call radii, because I'm going to change the radius based on the value of the character. And I'm going to get the radii by using or converting the character to its numerical value. So I'm going to use byte or the byte method to convert those characters into numbers. And that's what's going to create our flower, because we have a bunch of spaces inside of our strings or inside of each of the lines of the lyrics, and those have lower values, so they are going to create the flowers for us. And of course, as per usual, for a circle using cosine and sine, we'll also need the slice or the angle for each of the slices, and then I'll need center x and center y, and finally the radius that we're going to use from here. Or I'll just use radii directly inside of the for loop, so we're not going to need the radius right now. And finally, I'll need a size and a color. The size is going to be the stroke width, and the color is going to be the color. And those are going to be random. And then I'll create the constructor. So for the constructor, I'll only pass in from this area, from this main tab, the length and the string. I'll actually just pass in the string right now instead of putting the length and the string both. So I'll just do string, and I'll do s equals underscore s. And then after that, I'll say length is going to equal s dot length. And because it's a string, then you have to make it this way. After, we'll do position. That will be a new p vector. And the length of the array is going to be the length, and the same for radii. That's actually a float, okay. And now the slice is going to be radians, because we're going to use cosine and sine, and I'm going to need radians for that. And we'll do 360 divided by the float of the length, if I can type today. For center X and center Y, I'm going to do something a little bit different. So I don't want to just put it in the center, but let's start with that. So for now, or let's make it random. So for now, I'm going to make center X random width and center Y random height. And then later we'll deal with that. We're just needing to establish everything that we're going to need for this flower. And later we'll try and fix everything just to make it a little bit more presentable. And finally, for size and color, I already have color over here, and it's going to be random. And for size as well, I'll make it a random value from 0.25 to, let's say, 1, because that is going to be the stroke width, and I want it to be really thin. And then for color, we're going to do the same thing that we've been doing for all of the other tutorials, or almost all of the other tutorials anyway. And then random from 0 to colors.length. And now let's initialize the points in our circle. I'll put that inside of an init method that I can just call in here. And this is simply going to loop through the characters and create the points around that circle, so we can draw the flowers with the curved vertices method. I is going to be less than the length. And we're going to have an X position and a Y position. The X position is going to be the cosine of the angle multiplied by the radius. And this is going to be the same thing, but with sine. After, we're going to add the points into the array, into the positions array, and it's going to be a new p vector with X position and Y position. Now for the angle, we're going to multiply I by the slice, which already gave me the angle because I divided 360 by the length of the characters. So that is giving me the angle of rotation for each point. And then for the radius, we can either create a variable called radius, and then we'll put radii inside of that. But I'll create the values inside of the radii array, and I'll just use it directly over here. So that is radii at I. And I said I'm going to use the byte method to convert the character into a numerical value. So we can grab that from the string, and then I'll say character at I, and that will be the value of my radius. You can also map those values because they're going to be smaller values, so you can just increase those values by mapping the current byte values into something much bigger. So I'll be creating that, and I'll just say radii I is going to instead equal, I'll call them minimum start or minimum S to maximum S for start. And then I'll do minimum R to max R for minimum radius to maximum radius. And I'll create them over here. So for minimum start, oh, and they're all going to be floats. For the starting value, I'm going to just go from 0, and then the max is going to be 255. And then I'll choose whatever values. So I chose something from 30 to 70. Actually, what I meant is not making it a bigger value. So I'm not mapping it to making it a bigger value. I'm just mapping the spaces because they're really small values. So they're going to just create something that maybe I'll show you how it looks and then how I fixed it with the mapping. And we're going to use this or whatever I created just now into here instead of creating another variable that we don't really need. That's pretty much for the initialization. So we already have the points. Now we just display them. So I'm going to create a style method for the styles, and I'll be creating two different styles. I think what I did is the first letter in the sentence, if it's a vowel, then we'll fill the shape. Otherwise, we'll just draw a stroke. And for that, I created a variable over here that I called F for fill. And then if it's F, then I want you to have no stroke and have a fill of color. Otherwise, no fill, and then stroke weight is going to have the size, and then stroke is going to be the color. Now we'll display it. And here we're going to draw curve vertices. And for curve vertices, we're going to need begin shape and end shape. And in between, we're going to draw all of the curve vertices. So that's gonna follow the same for loop over here. Maybe before changing the style, let's actually just make this false. So let's call this with just a stroke, just so we can see what we're actually creating. So I'll do position at 0, or at I actually. 0 is gonna come later. And then position at I and then Y. And just to see that things are actually working, we're going to create an object called flower over here. Let's create the array so we don't have to recreate everything all over again. And then in here, I'm going to define the length. And the length is going to be based on the array or the number of lines inside of our first text file or one of the text files. It's a little confusing now that I have 3 text files over here, but just focus on one of them. And the length is going to be the number of lines inside of my text file. So I'm just going to call it line and then dot length, and I'll create that over here. So that will be a string array that I'm going to call lines, and in here I'll load that file. It's going to be load strings, and that will be lyrics at 0 for now. Now let's draw, or let's actually create the flowers. You can either use lines.length or flowers.length. And now let's create the flowers. So at I, it's going to be a new flower object, and we're going to pass in the string. So that will be lines, or each of the lines separately, to create a flower for each one of them. And in here, I'm going to just call the background again. Later we'll do something different, but for now we'll just reset it with the background. And then I'll use a for in loop. So for flower, flower, and flowers. And usually I just run it to see if I'm missing something. Okay, we have everything in here because I forgot to add center X and center Y. Okay, I'm calling init before that. Now, as you can see, we have an incomplete flower, and the reason being that curve vertices needs at least 4 functions to have a full curve or to draw the curve. It needs 1 control point and then a point for the beginning of the curve and then a point for the end of the curve and finally the control point for the second curve point. So the majority are being created using the for loop. So this, every for iteration is taking from the one previous to it, but the first one doesn't have a control, or the first curve point doesn't have a control point before that. So we'll create that for it. And that will be the last point because we're going like this. So the control point should be before it, and that will be the last point in this array. Meaning position at length -1 dot x and position again at length -1 dot y. So if I run it again, you'll see that the gap is smaller, and that's because we need something after the last point. And that will be position at 0 dot x, position at 0 dot y, and then it's not the end yet. And I'll copy this and now we've closed the gap. So even if you move all of this, it's going to stay intact. And I actually learned this from the generative design book. I've seen work out there with people creating points around a circle where they have a gap, especially if they start moving their points. But in the generative design book, they did it this way, creating an array of points first and then using that to close the gap. So even when you're moving the points, you're not necessarily moving the curve vertices over here, you're moving whatever you sorted over here. So the first one is going to be always connected to the last one, and their movement is going to be the same because they're the same point. Also, if you want the code from the generative design book, the book here you've got to buy, but the code is available for free for everyone. Let's change the style based on the characters, and then I want to move it so it creates something a little bit more interesting to look at, and we'll finally organize it into our final shape. So for this, I'm going to use a switch statement. And before I create the switch statement, I'm going to grab the first character. So that will be the string. And then I want to convert it to lowercase because lowercase values are different from uppercase values. So I want to make sure that I have them all as lowercase, so I don't have to check for lowercase and uppercase. And then I'm going to get the first character. So I'll use the switch statement, and then I'm going to switch the character. For the first case, or for the first few cases, it's going to be a vowel. So I'm going to check for A, E, I, O, and U, and I'll just combine them all into one. And then finally it's going to be, or for the other case, it's going to be the default case. And then we'll have the stroke. So no fill, but for this one, we're going to have a fill. And I'm actually going to remove this from here because I only need to change the style, but I still want the curve vertex to stay the same. And then I'll break this. And as you can see, there are a bunch of lines that starts with a vowel. Now let's move it. So to move it, we're going to need an angle and a speed. I'll add that over here. So I'll call it our angle and then our speed. And I also want to create a random value just to rotate the speed. Usually what I would do is create a random value from a negative value to a positive value, but that gives me 0. So some of them are not going to have a speed at all. So they're not going to rotate. So instead I just create a random value and create 50% probability that one is going to rotate counterclockwise and the other 50% that is going to rotate clockwise. So now in here, I'm going to create the random value, and that will just be from 0 to 1. And then our angle is going to be a random value from 0.01 to 0.05. And then our speed is going to be a random value from, or actually, this is the speed. I don't know why I thought that was the angle. And then for the angle, it's going to be anything from 0 to 2 pi. And let's update, or let's create the update method that is going to move everything. So how I'm going to move this is by translating and rotating instead of just using it with cosine and sine, because I'm already initializing everything in here. So I'll just remove center X and center Y, and instead I'll put it over here, either inside of push matrix and pop matrix, or just push and pop, which combines push style and pop style, and then push matrix and pop matrix. In between, I'll put the translate method, and that will be center X and center Y. And then rotate is going to rotate using our angle. And then instead of displaying over here, I will call update, and then I'll call display over here. And then here, it's going to be our angle plus equal our speed. But because we want them to be random, so we want some of them to go clockwise and some of them to go counterclockwise, I'm going to have to use the random. So if rand, or the value of this variable, is greater than 0.5, so there's 50% chance that our angle is going to be added, or the speed is going to be added to the angle, else it's going to be subtracted. And now we have them rotating. Okay, now instead of background, let's do a rectangle. So I'll do push and pop because I want to have the styles just for this. It's going to have no stroke, it's going to have a fill of the background, but then it's going to only have maybe 50 opacity out of 255. And then there's going to be a rectangle, and it's going to go from 0, 0 to width and height. Now if I run it, we're going to have a shadow, and that looks more interesting to me. We can also, and it's what I actually did, we can also create a variable called t, and I'm going to map, and I learned to do, or to convert the frame count to radians to get a nicer look from the comments. So thank you to the person who commented that. And then that will go from -1 to 1, because that's the normal values for sine, to something a little bigger, because -1 to 1 is not going to do much to the opacity. I'll use t over here, and this is going to create different types of shadows as the animation runs. So you can see that it has more of a trace or more of an opaque trace when it becomes 10. And then when the opacity is increased to 45, then it creates less of a shadow. The final thing that we'll be creating is organizing these flowers. Or actually, the second to last thing that we're going to do is this. And then finally, we'll loop through all of these text files just to see the differences between all of them. Now for this, we're doing the same exact thing that we did over here. So I'll grab this and then I'll use whatever I have in here and slice as well. This is a whole mess right now, so just bear with me. I'm going to take this and now I can remove this. I don't need it anymore. And this is going to be lines dot length. So what I created over here is a slice just like the one I created over here. The only difference is that this grabs the number of characters inside of the string. This grabs the number of lines that we have, so we can organize our flowers because each flower resembles a line, right? And then this is going to be the radius, which we have over here. So let's initialize that to 0. And then we have the same thing over here. The only difference is that the slice now has a different angle. And then radius will change based on the length of each of the lines or the number of characters in the lines. And then I have the X position and Y position, which are going to be the center X and center Y for each of the flowers to move them wherever we want to move them. So I'll add that over here. And Y position, and we're going to have to add it to the constructor. Now instead of random, we'll use these. Now if I make it, or if I make this 200, let's say, actually, let's make it much bigger. And also I'm going to push this with width divided by 2 and height divided by 2, because I want this circle or this whole circle to have the center of the canvas. But now instead of this, I just did 500 to make sure that everything is working. But instead of this, I'm going to grab the character count, so the length of each of these lines, to organize these on different radii. So what I did is just a simple if conditional, and I did character count. So I created a variable that I called character count, and I'm going to just create over here, and that will be lines I.length. So if character count is greater than 0 and less or equal, and I think I did increments of 10, so let's do that. And then I'll do the same thing five times, I think. We'll do from 10, actually we have to do from 11 to 20, and then from 21 to 30, and then from 31 to 40, and finally from 41 to, let's say, 70. And the reason why I'm saying 70 is because I know in my lyrics the longest line has 60 something characters, so I'm just going up to 70 because I did check for the number of lines. I did create another array grabbing the character count of each of the lines, and then I got the maximum number just to check that I'm not missing any of them. But I'm not gonna do it over here just because this video is gonna be much longer and I don't need it to be that long. So for the first one, the radius is going to be, and I went from small upward. So I did width divided by 2 minus 500. And then I did the same thing decrementing these values. So this one is going to be minus 400, and then this one is 300, this one is 200, and finally 100. These are just arbitrary number that I like the look of. So I am going to run this, and we'll see that they're on different levels. I don't know why I thought this has to be 11, but I checked my code and it should be the same because this is only less than equal 10. So greater than 10 is definitely going to be greater than this. So now if I run it, it should work properly. Okay, so another thing that I did is create guides just for us to see that this is not chaos. And because I know that I'm decrementing here by 100, I just created a loop over here, again inside of a push and pop. And then I defined the stroke as the last color over here, and no fill because I just want them to be guides. And then I did for integer, you can also do 550. I actually did 2 variables in my first example, but I'll do it this way instead. So I'll start with 550, and then I is going to be less than the smallest that I want to get to, and that is 100. And then I is going to be minus equal 100. And then I created a circle at width divided by 2 and height divided by 2. And this is going to be the radius. So width divided by 2 minus I, and these are going to be the values. But I actually added 50 to this because I don't want the line to go through each of these circles. I want them to go before and after. And because this is a radius, I'm going to multiply it by 2 just to get the diameter or the width of the circle. This should be greater because I'm decrementing and not incrementing. Okay, so we did get the circles that we need. Let's make this greater than 0 instead because I also want the last line. And then I'll make this with an opacity of 10. You can also put this on a different layer using P graphics just so you don't get this oscillating opacity because of this. Now you have the line with the least number of characters in here, and then going up, you're gonna see the ones that have more characters in the one line. Now the final thing that I wanna do, and that is extremely simple and very short, and it's going to be inside of the key released function. So we're going to check if key equals whatever. I'm going to make it n for next. And then I'll do lyrics count or file count, let's make it. And I'll add that, or I increase that by 1, and then I'll call the setup method again. And the reason why I'm increasing a file count right now is because later I want to get the number over here using the file count. So file count modulo the lyrics.length. And then I'll create file count over here. So what this does is that it's going to, every time this increases, I'm getting the remainder of dividing it by the length of these lyrics. So for now it's 3, so it's going to be 0, 1, 2 every time. So even if this is higher than 2, it's still going to go back to 0, 1, 2 every time. Now if I run this and I hit the N key, you're gonna see the lyrics for the other files. I mean, you're gonna see them at the same position every time, but you're gonna see the colors change because we're using random. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope the explanation was easy enough to follow. So if you have any ideas for how to enhance this, please comment it below. I really love reading the comments, especially if you have ideas related to how you can organize this. Okay, I hope you had fun, and I'll talk to you soon.